and we sell the Carrier, Bryant, Day and Night, and Payne products. Today we're going to be talking about indoor air quality fundamentals. So this is going to be kind of a 101 course on IAQ, and we're not going to focus on product. Today's mostly the how and why to use it. This webinar is, I'll say, works for PDH credits, or PDH credit as it is. And this is my first time using the questions, so please be patient. I'm going to try to get through this. So with that, we will get started. When we talk about indoor air quality, really what I try to cover is why people need indoor air quality, and if you can find the need, you can see the opportunity and offer solutions. And the solutions should not only lead to profits, but to happier customers. And that's really what this whole presentation is about. If you can understand the need, you can offer a solution, make your customers happy, and make a few bucks in the process. So if I start at the beginning, I can take most indoor air quality problems and put them into one of three buckets. And those buckets are particulate, microbials, and gases. Now, if you don't remember anything else from this presentation, remember these three things: particulate, microbials, and gases. And we try to remember that by PMG. And the point of saying that is, if you can figure out what type of problem you're dealing with, you can then diagnose that problem and offer a solution. So what is particulate? Particulate is that dust, dander, pollen. These are the things that I like to say make people sneeze. There's also a lot of different kinds of dust. It's not just dust and dander and pollen. I throw this slide up here because it's been about 9 months ago. A meteor hit over Russia. I don't even know if that's politically correct, but meteor hit over Russia, and in the red there you can see that 6 months, 9 months later, that meteor dust is still floating around in the atmosphere. It's going to be there for a really long time, and at some level we end up breathing that kind of stuff out in the atmosphere. Microbials. So this is the M. Microbials are single-cell living organisms. These are your viruses, your bacteria, mold spores. These are the things that I like to say make people sneeze. So this is going to bring us to our first question. I'm going to try to pop this thing up. All right. So I think that it's showing me that the question is open. So I'm going to give you just a moment, or maybe even a minute, to answer this, and then I'll close it. All right, let me say last call for this question. We'll close that. All right, so gases. So we talked about particulate, we talked about microbials, and now we're talking about gases. And I like to break gases into two different categories. The first one is odors, and odors are generally something you can smell. The problem with that is you can't smell every gas. You know, for the most part, we're in the HVAC industry, and we know that we deal with carbon monoxide. And carbon monoxide is a gas. You cannot smell it, and it can kill you. So it's a very dangerous gas that you can't smell. So when I say odors and I associate that with gases, it's pretty generic, but for the most part, you can still smell an odor, and the odor is a gas. To give you an example, we deal with a lot of odors in the IAQ industry, and one we're dealing with this week is a cannabis grow factory. And when you think about odors, it's not always the person or the place creating the odors that has an issue with it. It's the neighbor. So in this case, it's not the grow factory. It's more likely the person next door who's going to have an issue with it, or maybe codes in certain instances. You know, or the most typical example is like a cigar shop. You know, you could have 10 guys in there smoking a cigar, and they don't mind that it smells like cigars, but the beauty shop next door really does. They have an issue with it. So odors are definitely a problem for IAQ, but it's not always the person creating the odor who has the issue. It's usually a neighbor or somebody else. The other aspect of gases is VOCs. And VOC stands for volatile organic compound. And the problem with VOCs is that they're everywhere. I mean, just look around wherever you're sitting. It's in the carpet. It's in the paint. It's in most wood furniture. You know, it's in the ceiling tiles. So you can't get away from it. And this is very typical of the new home smell. So if you ever walked into a new home and, you know, it smells like a new house, what you're really smelling is VOCs. And it's not a good thing. It's in carpet. You know, you get brand new carpet and it smells like new carpet. Stain, even a new car. And it's everywhere because the poster child of VOCs is formaldehyde. And formaldehyde is, they use it as an adhesive. So what that means is it's everywhere. You can't get away from it. And just recently, formaldehyde was classified as a carcinogen. So it causes cancer. So that new house smell, that new car smell that everybody loves actually causes cancer. And it's bad news. So I say it's bad news. What does that mean? Well, if you read this list, VOCs cause a lot of things. You know, if you're coughing and wheezing, you're not feeling real well. You know, you can almost be considered sick from VOCs. And as you are exposed to more and more of VOCs, these symptoms get worse. You know, we're starting to talk about sore throats, coughs, sinus infections. You know, it can cause a lot of problems. And I don't want to get too crazy, but high-level exposure or long-term exposure can lead to things not only like cancer, but liver damage, kidney damage, those kind of things. And I said two things there, long-term exposure and high-level exposure. High-level exposure is basically when you're subject to a whole lot of VOCs or chemicals in a short amount of time. So maybe a guy is working in a factory and somebody spills a huge vat of chemicals right next to him, and he gets a huge whiff of that. That would be a high-level exposure. You know, he might have to go to the emergency room right at that minute. But let's take that same factory worker and a guy has to clean with ammonia or bleach or various chemicals day in and day out. So day in, day out, he's fine, but over the course of 30 years, he's breathing that in, and it causes problems, like you see on this list, and all of a sudden he's got long-term exposure to VOCs and certain chemicals. So that said, bad stuff is trapped inside the space. Space could be a home or a workspace, and we breathe a lot. On average, we breathe 6 to 12 liters a minute. Now, the difference is, you're breathing 6 liters a minute if you're sitting at a desk talking on the phone. You're breathing 12 liters a minute if you're running a marathon. But what I want you to think about is if you were drinking 12 liters of water a minute, how concerned would you be with the water quality you were putting in your body? Inside the air we breathe is solids. We breathe almost 2 tablespoons of solids a day. Now, I don't want to say the most of us, but if you took the average young, healthy male, and he's breathing in 2 tablespoons of solids a day, it's probably not going to harm him at all. But you take that same 2 tablespoons a day and you start giving it to somebody who's elderly, or somebody who has autoimmune diseases, or somebody who has allergies, asthma, all of a sudden their body has a much tougher time fighting or overcoming those solids in the lungs. And this, I believe, brings me to our next poll question, so bear with me just a moment. And I am launching the next question. I believe that this poll is open. I'm going to give you just about a minute to answer this thing. All right, I'm going to say last call to answer this question. I'm going to close this one out. All right, so we talked a little bit about particulates, microbials, gases, VOCs. VOCs causing problems. So who is at risk? If I was standing in front of you, I would ask, does everybody in this room know somebody who has allergies or asthma? And every hand would go up. It's very rare that I find anyone who doesn't know someone who has allergies and asthma, because it's so prevalent that we all know somebody. So when I talk about IAQ, historically we've talked about people with allergies and asthma, but now we're starting to talk about people with kids, people with pets. It's really people in general. And why is that? Because people don't want to get sick. It costs a lot of money, not only for medicines and insurance and going to the doctor, but you got to stay home. And then one kid gets sick, and then the next kid gets sick. It's really a vicious circle, and it costs a lot of money. If we start talking about building specific problems, the most common one is sick building syndrome. And sick building syndrome is when a person or a group of people go to work and they feel bad. You know, they feel sick. They leave and they feel better. And leaving could, you know, just be for lunch. It could be just, you know, for a little break, whatever it is. But they get out of the building and they feel better. Now, I'm talking about real problems, you know, chronic issues. This isn't the Monday morning hangover or where somebody just doesn't want to be at work. This is real problems by real people. And what I'd like to bring up is that if I get a call and I'm looking at a sick building, and I go through that building and, you know, people aren't feeling good, and I find that the copy machine is producing excess VOCs. Maybe it's producing some ozone. And the people breathing in all those VOCs and ozone are the ones having issues. At that point, we've got a lot of solutions. You know, we can move the copy machine. We can move the people. You know, we can bring in fresh air. We can, you know, install a purifier to get rid of that stuff. So we have a lot of solutions, but my point is that's not really a sick building, even though it might get labeled that. What that is, you know, a copy machine that was too close to human beings. If I go into that same building and people are getting sick, they don't feel well, and I can't find the problem, does that mean we don't have any solutions? Now, the answer is no. You know, we can still bring in fresh air. We can add a purifier. We can move people. There's a lot of things we can do, but my point is that truly is a sick building, and it's a sick building because we cannot find the problem. Another common issue we see all the time is dirty sock syndrome. Dirty sock syndrome is when you walk into a space and it smells musty, you know, kind of like a dirty sock, right? Think the smell of a locker room, maybe a gymnasium, that kind of thing. What I can tell you is that 9 out of 10 times the owner is going to say, I have mold. I know because I smell it. It's got to be somewhere. It smells musty. And what I would tell you is that 9 out of 10 times you'd be wrong. What we have usually is bacteria. And more specifically, we have bacteria on the HVAC coil. And if you think about bacteria, what does it do? It decomposes stuff. And you get a lot of stuff trapped on that A coil. And as it decomposes, it creates a smell, and that smell is called dirty sock syndrome. And we've got a lot of products that can not only get rid of the odor, but actually kill the bacteria. And one last point on bacteria is that no matter how good you are, you cannot see bacteria. So you could have a whole colony, I'm talking millions and millions of bacteria on a coil, and you're never going to see it. You need a microscope. So it's extremely tough to diagnose by the average HVAC guy. So if I bottom line this, bad stuff is in the home, and we end up breathing it. So if you don't do something to get rid of it, your filters, your lungs become the filter and have to do the job of getting rid of all the bad stuff that is in the home or in the space. So that brings me to filters. And there's a ton of different kinds of filters, and there's a lot of different terminology. And we're going to talk about these. So media, electronic air cleaner, HEPA, electrostatic, MERV ratings, and CADR ratings. So the first filter we're going to talk about is a media filter. And this is really anything from typical fiberglass to old horsehair to, you know, you name it, a lot of glass materials. But really what I'm focusing in here is on filters or media filters that are MERV 8 to about MERV 13. Now, the nice thing about these filters are that they're pretty inexpensive. You know, they don't cost an arm and a leg to replace. Problem with that is they're easy to replace. You know, so you can walk into any Home Depot on the planet and get a media air filter. So that means homeowners can change it themselves. It causes a little bit of problem. And all the competition out there makes it extremely difficult for a homeowner to choose what type of filter they need. The good points for media air cleaners is that they do a great job at catching the big stuff. And by big stuff, I usually mean pollen. But probably the number one thing that we forget about is that good media air cleaners do a great job at protecting the equipment. You know, so the homeowner just dropped how many thousands of dollars to put in new equipment, and you're going to use a 1-inch filter that, you know, barely catches anything, and a lot of that stuff gets caught on the coil, which leads to bacteria and other sorts of issues. So media filters do a great job at protecting the equipment. Electronic air cleaners. So the beautiful thing about these is that they start to catch smaller particles. They're thinner than most, I'll say, media air cleaners that are of equivalent rating values. So to have a media that does the job of an electronic, that unit gets pretty big. So EACs are thinner. Problem with electronic air cleaners is that they have to be maintained. I would say minimum twice a year. Quarterly would be ideal. Not everybody does that, so they're hard to keep really efficient. They fall off pretty dramatically. So the technology hasn't really changed with electronic air cleaners, so it's considered older technology. So the story between electronic air cleaners and media air cleaners is that if you look at kind of where that 50% efficiency is on the left-hand side of the table, and that red line going up, that would be your media air cleaner. So it starts off less efficient, but it gets more efficient as it catches more stuff. Problem with that is, hey, you got to change it. If you don't change it, you're going to be there on a service call, you know, digging that filter out of a blower housing. If you look up on the left-hand side where the 90 is, that would be your electronic air cleaner. And over time, it gets less efficient. As it gets less efficient, you have to clean it. If you don't clean it, it just continues to fall. My point in this is that those two paths always intersect somewhere. I don't care which brands you're talking about, they're going to intersect somewhere. So I get asked all the time, which one do I want? I said, well, it doesn't really matter to me. You know, but if you do an electronic, you have to clean it. If you do a media, you got to change the filter. Simple as that. So a lot of different ways to purify. And one of the newest ways of doing that is what we call charge, capture, kill technology. And what this does is utilizes the technology of an electronic and combines it with a media. So you get the efficiencies of an electronic with the ease of maintenance from a media air cleaner. And really what we're doing is charging the air that comes through this filter, and then we are grounding the filter material to make it attract more and make that filter more efficient. So it's basically positive and negatively charged air getting attracted to a grounded media. Once it's there, we kill it. Now, when I say we kill it, I get asked all the time, if a standard filter permanently captures whatever we're capturing, what's the big deal with killing it? In other words, what's the difference between permanently capturing something or killing something? They said, well, really what it boils down to is think of doing maintenance at a hospital, and you're in the tuberculosis wing, and you got to change those filters. Now you should be covered from head to toe, regardless. But do you want living tuberculosis on a filter, or do you want dead tuberculosis living, on that filter? Because the minute you start to pull that filter out and it gets caught, and it rustles a little bit, a lot of those spores, a lot of that particulate, a lot of those germs become airborne, and if you're not protected, you're going to be breathing them. And not only you who might be breathing them, but you just sent that stuff right through the return and back into the space. So the difference between permanently capturing and killing is which one do you want to breathe? The only other thing I can say on this is that when you have living organisms on a filter, giving the right type of organism in the right conditions, it can spread and grow on a filter. It's been more than once where we've seen bad stuff growing on filters. And if you're killing it, you're that much further ahead. So, HEPA stands for High Efficiency Particulate Arrestor. Some people like to call it air filter. It's really, I'd say, your call. But what HEPA means is that a filter is 99.97% effective at capturing particles down to 0.3 microns. So it's a standard, and to be considered HEPA, you have to meet that standard. The problem is these HEPA filters are usually bypass. Why? Because they're so absolute that you couldn't really use them in a standard application without it being a bypass. You just get no airflow. And this is going to bring us to another question. So bear with me just a moment. And I believe this question is launched. I'll give you about a minute. All right, I'm going to say last call for this question. Close this guy out. All right, so electrostatic filters. The beautiful thing about these is that they're 1 inch. Occasionally you'll see a 2 inch. So this is a filter that slides into the existing filter grill, and then you run 24 volts to it, and it makes these filters much more efficient than a standard 1 inch filter. I'd be very careful with the claims here. And if you sell a lot of these, I apologize. I would just look at the tests and look at what they're claiming and see which way you go. We do know that they are pretty efficient, because if you don't change these in about 3 months, you'll be out there on a service call. That furnace is going to go off on limit. So just be careful with that one. All right, so MERV ratings. MERV ratings stands for Minimum Efficiency Reporting Value. So ASHRAE sets these standards, And residentially, you have a 1 through 16 rating. 1 is kind of the worst filter, 16 would be the best. And as we go into commercial, they raise that rating up to 20. So it would be a 1 through 20 scale, but we've never seen a residential that's been higher than 16. Couple problems with MERV is that you can't test electronic air cleaners because they use a carbon dust, and carbon doesn't mix real well with electricity. The one other problem we see with the MERV rating is that they don't take static into account. So what do I mean by that? A piece of cardboard, is definitely a MERV 20. We're catching everything. Problem is you can't really use it because we're not getting airflow. So while a piece of cardboard is a MERV 20, it doesn't really make sense in any type of application. So, and I think we've got another poll question right here. Here we go. I'm going to launch this thing. All right, I'm going to say last call for this question. Okay, so here's a table that shows what MERV actually means. So this is a residential table. See, we stop at 16. Commercial would expand behind that, or beyond that, rather. In most standard media filters are going to be in that 8 to 13 MERV rating range. And until you get into a MERV 13 filter, what I want you to see is that less than 1 microns, you're not really catching a whole lot. That's really what I wanted to point out. Beyond that, things above 1 micron, you're pretty much the same, from a 9 to a 13. It doesn't change a whole lot. But the big difference is once you hit a MERV 13, you're starting to catch microns that are sub 1 micron. Now, it's hard to appreciate where MERV has taken us without going, back in time a little bit. Before the MERV rating, ASHRAE had 2 different tests. The first one I'm going to talk about is the arrestance test. So this was a test where you would take a, call it a used can of coffee grinds. We call it carbon dust. And you shoot that dust through a ductwork and the filter catches it. Now, if a filter in there catches 80% of used coffee grinds, that was an 80% efficient filter for the arrestance test. Now, let's take another filter, and instead of catching used coffee grinds, we're catching actual air. And we're starting to take stuff out of the air that you can't see. And this second filter takes 20% of bad stuff out of the air that you can't see. Well, you put both, filters on the shelf of Home Depot, and what happens? Do you want an 80% effective filter, or do you want a 20% effective filter? Well, what happened is most people took the 80% filter, not knowing that there was 2 different tests, and that's what made the world of filter testing so gray. And because there's so many issues with it, ASHRAE said, we're going to put everybody on the same playing field. Every filter takes the same test, And because of that, you get a number, and we get rid of that problem. So that is why the MERV rating was born. There's other tests out there. So we like MERV because ASHRAE does the testing, right? They set the standards. And if you're in the HVAC industry, you've probably heard of ASHRAE. I'll take that for granted. But some other filters decide to use other means of testing, and the most common, or the second most common, second to MERV, would be the clean air delivery rate. And what I want to point out is that this testing is done by AHAM. And AHAM is the Association of Home Appliance Manufacturers. Now, what does that mean? You know, they're dealing with things like ovens and dishwashers, but they're really big into things like portable dehumidifiers. So that's how they get into the air cleaning world. But what I want you to look at is some of the testimonials, or the, you know, what they're calling it. So they're saying this filter is 8 times more effective than a room HEPA filter. And my point is that a whole house anything should be way more effective than a room filter. That's just my 2 cents. So if you see CADR, stands for Clean Air Delivery Rate, and you want to look into that testing pretty closely. So, principles of filtration. There are 4 principles of filtration, and to be a HEPA filter, you have to utilize all 4. I'm going to actually talk about 5 because there's a new one that is not actually a principle, but it makes the other 4 more effective. So the first one is straining. And straining is actually the easiest to explain. You've got a big old particulate, and you got a small filter, and it's just too big to get through. So if you've ever made noodles at home, you know, you throw those noodles in a strainer, the noodles stay, but the water seeps out. It's the same idea. You got a big particulate that just cannot get through that filter. The second one is impaction. So what you've got is a smaller particulate, and this particulate's going pretty fast, and it's what I like to call the head-on collision. So it's going really fast, and it slams smack dab into that filter and gets caught. Now, interception. So if you seen the football game, you know what interception is. But what I want you to notice is that we're dealing with smaller particulate still. Now this particulate is actually small enough to make its way through the filter. But as it does, it kind of gets picked off on the side. You know, maybe it's stuck on something. And then diffusion. Diffusion is the hardest one to explain because we're starting to deal with extremely small particulate. Now, this particulate is, you know, very small and can easily get through the filter. But on most return drops, you're making, you know, a 90-degree turn, and there's a lot of turbulence right there. You know, air's coming back, it's getting pulled through, it's hitting the bottom of the ductwork, and then it's got to go through a filter. So this guy actually makes its way through the filter, but because of all the turbulence there, it kind of gets picked off on that back side of the filter. So those are the 4 principles of filtration. And then the new one that we add to it is electrostatic. Now this is not a principle, but this concept makes the other 4 principles more effective. So you take any size particulate, you charge it, and then you oppositely charge the filter material, and it's going to attract. So it makes those other 4 principles more effective. So some terminology. I've been talking about microns pretty much last 15, 20 minutes. What I want you to see is that on the back of a postage stamp, you can fit over 25,000 microns on the back of a postage stamp. So think about that the next time you have to lick a stamp. And I don't know if anybody licks stamps anymore. A few other concepts, depth loading. So depth loading is the opposite of face loading. So face loading is where you pull out a filter, the side of the return is dirty, the side of the furnace is clean. Everything gets caught on that front side, and anything that gets pushed through, gets caught on the coil. So depth loading is the exact opposite, and it starts collecting all the way at the back end by the furnace, and then uses the entire filter to capture and hold particulate and dust. If you've ever seen, filters that have combs in them, this is why, because they catch so much stuff that without those combs, the filter would collapse. TFP stands for Turbulent Flow Precipitator. So, not going to ask you to remember that one, because it's a crazy terminology. But what this really means is that if we can slow down airflow, I can make filters more efficient. So what I want you to think is a piece of cardboard that has holes cut into it. Say dozens and dozens of holes. So as airflow is going through, it stops at the cardboard, but then slowly makes its way through those holes. And when we do that, we make filters more efficient. You will usually see this on HEPA type filters as a pre-filter. So the idea is you can change out the pre-filter every year or maybe every 6 months, and then you're changing out the HEPA filter every year to 2 years, depending on the system you have. Zapping refers to the older electronic air cleaners. You bang on that ductwork a little bit, and it starts to zap. Some people loved it because it made a little noise. They said, hey, my filter's working. I hear it. And then a few seconds later, you smelled it because that arcing, which was the zapping sound, created a little bit of ozone. So then you smelled it. You really knew it was working. And then settling. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but the heavier or the bigger the particle is, the quicker it hits the ground. So a 50 micron size particulate hits the ground in 12 seconds. You go to 10 microns, it's hitting the ground in about 5 minutes. And then 1 micron size or less is probably never going to hit the ground. So it's suspended in the air indefinitely. All right, so this is my State of the Union. And what I want to say is that even today, less than 1 out of 10 furnaces gets a whole house air cleaner. We're still using about 90% 1-inch fiberglass filters. And I hope I pointed out that we could really use a good filter on furnaces. So I'm going to tell you that people know that they want clean air. We know that because they buy millions and millions of portables every year. HVAC is still flat. We sell about the same amount of air cleaners every year. But portables continue to grow. Why is that? Because people don't know where to get air cleaners from. So who ends up cashing in? It's the Walgreens, because Johnny's sick and mom's at Walgreens picking up medicine. Hey, I'll pick up that air cleaner because it'll help them. That kind of thing. Portable air cleaners are not cheap. You look at this thing and it does about a 3-foot diameter range, and it's only $600. But if you buy them, you get free shipping. And if you remember the Ionic Breeze, these guys were basically sued out of business, but they are coming back because people are demanding it. They love an air cleaner that looks really good, and yet it doesn't really do anything. So the IAQ market is really big. And what I'm trying to point out is that we're not the only ones who notice that people have a lot of allergies, a lot of asthma, want healthy solutions. You know, there's millions and millions of people going directly after this market. And I want you to notice that the terminology is changing. You know, there's a much more greener spin, but we're going away from, you know, masking odors to healthing. And it's not just Lysol, it's Febreze. There's tons of other examples that I'm not going to spend a lot of time on. My point is, it's a huge market. Otherwise, these companies would not be taking notice. All right, so as we jump into humidity, and I'm going to go quick because I think I'm running a little short on time. Talk about the terms and why people want them, different types, measurements. So the terms, I go through this mainly to make sure everybody's on the same page. Humidity is the water vapor in the air. Absolute humidity is what that humidity weighs. So it's what the water weighs in the air. RH stands for relative humidity. And this is what I like to call the moving target, because it always changes based on temperature. And it's really what the air can hold, relative humidity. Dew point. This is what I like to call the cold beer can. You know, this is when that air condenses as it hits something cold. You reach dew point, and it creates actual water. Dry bulb. We deal with this all the time. You know, this is the temperature on the thermostat. This is the temperature on a thermometer. It's the actual temperature in the space. And then Dalton's law. This is the one nobody's ever heard of. Dalton's law is what I like to call the sponge theory. So this is where if you introduce humidity on one side of a building, it will eventually get to the other side of the building. Now, I say eventually, which means this law means that humidity will always try to seek its own level. And when I say try, if there's a big hole in the wall, it may never get to the other side of the building. You take a house that's got a huge fireplace, it might not get to the other side. So the law is always into effect. It doesn't always work out if there's something that is combating that law. So you can hang your hat on the law, it's into effect, but just because it's 35% relative humidity on one side does not mean it's 35% relative humidity on the other side. So the number one reason people buy a humidifier for is comfort. And the easiest way for me to explain this is when you take a shower and you step out of that shower, you feel very comfortable. You open the door to the hallway and you feel very cold. Why is that? It's not because the temperatures are any different. It's because you've got a lot of relative humidity in that bathroom. When you open the door, that humidity is moving outside and you feel cold. That's called evaporative cooling. Another reason, preservation. So you think about wood floors, expensive cabinets, crown molding, artwork, instruments, those kind of things. As wood expands and contracts with the gain and loss of humidity, it tends to crack. So you want to keep it constant and preserve wood and artwork. Energy savings. Because you feel more comfortable, you can turn the thermostat down 1 or 2 degrees and feel as comfortable as you did. Also, with the wood not shrinking and expanding, especially around doors and windows, you're not getting as much infiltration in. So you're able to save energy there as well. Well-being. Now, I'm not a doctor, but there's a direct correlation between, cold, dry months and people getting sick, and warm, humid months in people not getting sick. Humidifiers come in a lot of different flavors. Residentially, the most popular is flow-through, and flow-through come in two other flavors, which is power and bypass. Power is going to have its own fan, and a bypass is going to use the equipment's fan to pull the water vapor from the humidifier. There's also a lot of other kinds like drums and atomizing, but the most popular after flow-through would be steam, and we're seeing the rise of steam in residential applications. So flow-through units, like I said, are power or bypass. They're going to have some sort of a wetted element. Usually these are a aluminum pad. But what I want you to notice is that an 18 gallon per day unit means you're getting or putting about 6 gallons per day into the space. So most of the water is actually going down the drain. So out of 18 gallons, you're saving about 6. Flow-through units don't always fit. They're kind of big, but they're inexpensive, and they work with pretty much anybody's equipment. Steam units are nice because they generate their own heat, and they use 100% of the water. You can mount them remotely, which means you can put them on a wall and then run a tube into the equipment and run the unit as needed, not just when the equipment is on. A few other types, there are still drum types out there, as scary as that is, but this guy is basically a sponge that, rotates in a bed of water. They might as well call these, Legionnaire humidifiers, because they're always a problem. You got stagnant water in a dark place with a sponge. It's crazy. Atomizing. So these things were like a plague a while ago. They were everywhere. So you mount this box somewhere near the equipment, you run a 1/4-inch line to the plenum, and this guy just sprayed water on the coil. Great idea because they fit anywhere. They were inexpensive. The problem is water creates calcium and lime, and all of a sudden that water doesn't always shoot on the coil. It shoots on things like circuit boards and causes a lot bigger problems. Commercially, I like units that have cylinders. A lot of them use drains, but the draining doesn't always work because of all that lime and calcium. So cylinders are nice because you replace them, and you get almost a brand new unit every year instead of having one that's all gummed up. So how do you pick? You pick based on capacity, and capacity is based on the volume, and then it's the volume times the air changes. So new house, I figure an half air change an hour. Old house is going to be, about 2 to 3 air changes an hour, which really gets into, what unit can work. After that, you want it to be able to install easy and be able to maintain it. So according to, well, I like to say ASHRAE. This is an old ASHRAE comfort window. But what I want you to see here is where we have ideal humidity, and it's a pretty short window. And you can almost move this out to about 30 to 60. I like a shorter window, but ASHRAE is going to tell you somewhere between 30 and 60, and in this case, 40 to 60 relative humidity. And I think this takes us to another poll question. Just a second. Yeah, I'm going to launch this thing. All right, I'm running short on time, so I'm going to say last call for this question. All right, so this is my friend, the dust mite. And dust mites eat dead skin. So people shed skin all the time. These guys love to eat it. So we shed skin all the time. And if you think about it, where do we spend about a third of our life? I know most of you are saying at work, but the answer I'm looking for is we sleep for, generally about 8 hours a day. So where do you think these guys like to hang out? Yeah, they like to hang out in mattresses. Now, years ago, I would talk about dust mites and all the crazy stuff with air cleaning, but I'm not talking about dehumidification. Why? Because if you go down to, on the left, you see dust mites. And you see that little chart there. Dust mites cannot survive in an area that is less than 50% relative humidity because they absorb water through their body. They don't drink water per se. They absorb it. And if there's not much humidity in the air, they're not going to survive. Now, I don't have a lot of time, but I'm going to say you can have a low relative humidity in the space. But if you have somebody who's going to bed with, say, a wet head, and that pillow is getting real wet, that's going to change the relative humidity inside that pillow. Or if you leave wet towels in the carpet or on the bed, that changes things. So you could have less than 50% in the air and still have dust mites if you have higher relative humidity in certain spaces. I'll say that from experience. That one took forever to figure out. Some other reasons you might want a dehumidifier. Keep condensation off the windows and to keep wood floors from buckling. Obviously, if you've got a basement that looks like this, we're kind of out of time. A lot of different types of dehumidifiers and applications for them. I'd say the most popular is portable units, but whole house and basement units are becoming more and more popular, and then also bigger commercial units for pool rooms, that kind of thing. Why would somebody want a whole house dehumidifier? Because they cost 10 times as much as, say, a portable. Well, the real reason is a TXV. Whole house units have a TXV, portables have a cap tube. Doesn't sound like a huge difference, but that TXV allows a whole house unit to work at colder temperatures. Now, do you remember that company I was talking about, AHAM, that works with appliances? They set the standards for portable dehumidifiers. And those standards are 80 degrees and 60% relative humidity. So can you think of a basement in Chicago that is 80 degrees and 60% relative humidity? I'm going to tell you no. It's more like 65 degrees and 60% relative humidity plus. So portable units don't work real well. They've got a really hard time getting to dew point. And that's where whole house dehumidifiers make a lot of sense for, wet basements. Oh, sorry. Next thing we're going to talk about is ventilation. I'm going to try to do this pretty quick. When we think of new houses, these houses are wrapped in Tyvek tape. I like to call it a Barbie doll house wrapped in saran wrap. So we trap all this stuff in the space. A lot of this stuff is VOCs, which you already talked about. Well, the problem is you can't get rid of it. So you need a HRV or an ERV. So this is usually where I ask people, what is the difference between heat and energy? Heat is basically latent heat. temperature. Energy is temperature plus humidity. So an HRV only gets rid of latent heat. We need a drain, and you can use it for all climates. An ERV is going to transfer not only heat, but the moisture, and it works really well in warmer climates. So how does this thing work? We've got four pipes. One is from the return, one is from the outdoor air, and we bring that outdoor air into the supply, and we take return air and we exhaust it out. It goes through a core where we capture the energy. This is just a picture of a core, and it's what I call the heart of the unit. Also got some fans and controls, but it really comes down to the core. There's a lot of different types of cores. You can see counterflow, you can see crossflow, there's many wheels. Oh, and I like to show this. When we start transferring moisture in a cold climate, moisture has a tendency to freeze. And this is what a frozen core would look like. Now what I want you to think about is how much air is getting through there. Probably not the intended airflow. When it does defrost, we see separation. And then how much of it is cross-contaminating now? You know, it's probably not the standard, you know, less than 1-2%. Commercially, it's code, and we're able to save a ton of money as we're preconditioning the air that has to come in to meet code. And I apologize as I'm trying to go through this pretty quick. So in our basic, the most basic sense of ventilation, we bring in outside air through an economizer, and then we exhaust it out via a fan. When we add an ERV/HRV into the mix, we're doing the same thing. It looks a little bit more complicated, but it's really the same idea. We're bringing in fresh air via the HVAC unit and the ERV. We're pulling building air and exhausting it out. And in the middle there, we're stealing the energy. Air purification devices. One of the oldest technologies is UV lights. UV lights are basically electromagnetic radiation. UV lights come in different flavors. UVA is your black light. So this might take you back to your college days, but don't stay there too long. We got stuff to do. UVB, if you're out in the sun too long, you get a suntan, maybe you get a sunburn. That would be UVB rays. UVC is we start actually killing stuff. And by stuff, I usually mean germs, bacteria, viruses. And then the one I want you to really look at is the UVO, UVV, UVX. This is your oxidizing spectrum. This is when a UV light is at 185 nanometers. And what that means is we are creating ozone. So those little words are code for ozone. So how does UV light work? Well, it penetrates the cell and basically scrambles its DNA. So UV light hits a cell, scrambles its DNA, and then it neuters it so that it can't reproduce, and it renders it harmless. Now, like I stated before, UV lights have been around for a long time. Created or discovered in the 1800s. In the 1900s, it was used to control the tuberculosis outbreak. And that guy even won a Nobel Peace Prize. So UV lights kills mold, bacteria in HVAC systems, reduces maintenance costs, and then reduces airborne contaminants. Now, airborne contaminants, I just want to clarify, air is moving way too fast for UV lights to kill stuff as it passes by. So what do I mean by it reduces airborne contaminants? If you're able to keep a coil clean, when that fan starts, you're not dislodging stuff versus not having one. Now, mold is one of those things where, years ago, the word mold was gold. And today it's kind of like mold is old. But what I'm trying to point out here is that there are new molds. And this one is called C. Gotti. And this guy is coming up from the south and making its way north all the way into Canada. It's coming from trees, and the good thing is you have to inhale it. You can't give it to the person standing next to you. What I want you to see here is the list of symptoms. And the problem with these symptoms is, A, they take 2 months to occur. So you breathe in this mold, and 2 months later you start getting these symptoms. So this is where I would ask, is anybody allergic to cats? Because cats is almost an instantaneous allergic reaction, or within 5 minutes. So if you're allergic to cats and you walk into a room with cats, you know it within 5 minutes. With this guy, you breathe in this mold and you get this whole list of symptoms 2 months later. So what I'm trying to point out is, think about going to the doctor with that list of symptoms. What are the chances he's going to say you inhaled a bad mold spore? Yeah, I can tell you that it's pretty low. Then, let's just say a year from then, he figures it out and says, hey, we've learned about this mold and we think you're a candidate. Once they start giving you the specific medication to get rid of this mold spore, it takes 6 months to recover. So my point is, bad mold spores are still out there, and they are making their way north. This picture is showing you that if you go just 3 inches from a UV light, you've lost 90% of its power. Does that mean it's not working? Absolutely not. It means you need long exposure times for that UV light to work. So there are some better options. And the newest one for UV lights is PCO. Stands for photocatalytic oxidation. This is where we use a UV light not only to clean the coil, but we're using it to create a chemical reaction with titanium dioxide, where it's going to go out and not only kill the viruses and bacteria, but we're getting rid of VOCs and chemicals. And then we're using a carbon, I'm going to call it a filter, to capture and slow down some of those microbials in the space. There's a lot of other options out there, like ozone, hydroperoxides, and ions, and I'd be happy to talk about any of those technologies with anyone offline. And I'm going to apologize about going over. And if there's any questions, God, I don't even think I checked them. I will get to the questions individually. And thank you so much for your time. I'm late, so I'm going to cut this one off.